A Clockwork Orange, an odd dystopian future created by Anthony Burgess and visualized by Stanley Kubrick. A world filled with Cockney jargon,
You're a big, strong chelevek like us all.
milk, and good old ultraviolence. Alex, our humble narrator and Droog, recounts his demise and then triumph to us, the audience, as we dive into the strange world of A Clockwork Orange. The main theme of A Clockwork Orange is very explicit to anyone who has read the book or watched the movie. As Alex is in prison requesting that his name be put in for the new experimental treatment so he can get out of prison early, the prison's church father explains what Burgess is getting at with the movie.
When a man cannot choose, he ceases to be a man.
Now, in case you're still confused by the title, A Clockwork Orange is exactly what the church father and the author of the book, Anthony Burgess, warns about. In the film, Alex and his droogs find their way into a writer's home, but we never see what he is writing. In the novel, however, it's made explicit that he's working on a manuscript for a philosophical text titled A Clockwork Orange. In Burgess's own words, a clockwork orange is someone who has the appearance of an organism lovely with color and juice, but is in fact only a clockwork toy to be wound up by God or the devil or the almighty state. This is one of the big differences between the novel and the film. Just as the young writer in the novel is trying to warn those people in the world of A Clockwork Orange, it appears that Burgess is warning us, the audience, what is important and paramount is human choice and freedom. Now, the philosophical underpinnings in the story are obvious, and I won't dive further into the free will debate going on throughout the film. What I'd like to discuss is another message that is relayed to the audience, which is the question of science, its goals, and consequences. Specifically, let's look at how the film views psychology and how it relates to Alex's condition. Throughout A Clockwork Orange, Alex is trying to be pulled in different directions. Whether it be by religion, social norms, or politics, nothing comes close to actually altering Alex as a person as science in the form of the Ludovico treatment. Just as a reminder, the film's Ludovico treatment is a form of conditioning that was used and is commonly associated with Pavlov, the psychologist. The idea is this: a person has some sort of experience, and during this experience, a stimulus is introduced. At first, this stimulus is not associated with the experience. After repeated introductions of the stimulus during the experience, the subject starts to associate the stimulus with the experience and is now conditioned. Now, this doesn't seem so bad by itself, and conditioning isn't malicious in and of itself. A Clockwork Orange seeks to take this idea to its logical conclusion and answer the question of how far can and should we push this idea. The result does curb Alex's violent tendencies, however, there is an unintended consequence that isn't as explicit as the problem of choice. The treatment is so terrible to Alex because of its unintended consequence of alienating Alex from himself. Throughout the movie, we see two different versions of Alex, one as a person and one as a performer. Alex has an inner self and an outer self. After his treatment, Alex is not able to connect with his inner self or Alex the person. Taking a term from psychologist R.D. Laing, we can say that Alex has a false self system. In Laing's book, The Divided Self, Laing discusses schizophrenia and its roots. Instead of approaching the illness from a purely biological perspective, Laing takes a more existential point of view. This false self-system that Alex has developed, or rather was thrust upon him by the treatment, is something that appears in many of the schizophrenic patients that Laing had dealt with in his clinical practice. The idea is that individuals create an outer self that is inherently different and often contradictory to what we can call an inner self. In other words, how their true nature really is. Laing discusses a case in The Divided Self as follows: there was hardly anything else he did, for all his other actions were ruled not by his will but by an alien will, which had formed itself within his own being. Laing continues to say, this usually amounts to an excess of being good, never doing anything other than what one is told, never being a trouble, never asserting or even betraying any counter will of one's own. Being good is not, however, done out of any positive desire of the individual's own part to do the things that are said by others to be good, but is a negative conformity to a standard that is the other's standard and not one's own. In the schizophrenic person, this is due to a lack of an inner self or a good grounding in how you actually exist. Alex is divided. Even as he is narrating his story in the film, at one point he refers to himself as he instead of I.
He was sentenced to 14 years in Starger number 84F.
We view Alex and his inner thoughts as Alex the person, but we also see how he is Alex the performer. He is constantly putting on a performance, though he always has a good grounding in who he actually is as a person. Evidence of Alex the performer within the film is further exemplified in a few specific scenes. The first scene is the fight between Alex and his droogs and Billy Boy and his droogs. When this fight occurs, Billy Boy is on a stage when Alex comes in. As the fight ensues, theatrical music plays and the fight scene appears to be choreographed as if the two gangs are in a dance during a performance. The next scene is Alex in the writer's home. Again, Alex's movements look as though they're calculated and choreographed. He sings and wears a mask while he's participating in the violence. It's as if he's on stage performing for an audience. The last example that I'll show really demonstrates the shift in Alex due to the treatment. This time Alex is on a stage, though this is not his choice. He no longer is able to have a distinction between his inner and outer self, and all that's left of Alex is Alex the performer. In the introduction to The Divided Self, Lang discusses how we can view humans. His take is that we can view individuals as either people or organisms, and how we first see an individual determines how we treat them. We can very clearly see that the Ludovico treatment treats Alex as an organism and not as a person. The minister is not concerned with treating Alex as a person, but with creating a new organism by eliminating Alex's inner self. This is important as it highlights really why this treatment is so horrific. Alex and his grounding as a person is shattered. Alex the performer becomes the totality of his character. Alex had always had an inner self to retreat to, and he was secure and grounded in his nature. Alex had a very clear picture of who he actually was. At this point in the film, Alex is suffering outwardly as his family and old friends abandon him, though now he has no sanctuary or refuge to retreat inside. The things that gave him pleasure and where he found beauty, his ultraviolence, are no longer accessible to him, and Alex the person is no longer available to him. This is the true tragedy of the film, that Alex was a divided person, and the science that sought to cure him only furthered his problem and abandoned him as a person. The whole grounding and security that Alex had available to him through his inner and true self is no more. Though a brief scene and used primarily as a way to relay that Alex is back to normal, we get a glimpse at a difference between two branches of psychology in their treatment of individuals. When Alex is in the hospital after his suicide attempt, we see a psychotherapist come to give Alex a test. When Alex is to say the first thing that comes to mind when shown an image, immediately he uses profanity and violent imagery. The response of the psychotherapist wasn't to condemn Alex for his speech, but she tells him, "Good."
Quite enjoying that.
Good, I'm glad.
This creates a stark contrast from the behaviorism that we saw earlier with the Ludovico treatment. Alex is not only allowed to have an inner self, but he is told that he can and should express it. Though this may not be the intention of Burgess, it does show an interesting favoritism towards psychotherapy as a more person-centered science as opposed to the organism-centered behaviorism. Though Kubrick's interpretation of A Clockwork Orange paints a beautiful picture and is certainly a masterpiece of a film, the ending of the movie does have a huge implication for how we should view people, and more specifically, Alex. One of the key differences between the film and the novel is the ending. Kubrick uses the American rendition of the novel, which excludes the final chapter from the novel that the rest of the world received. After Alex's bone-chilling last words, "I was cured all right," our story doesn't end there. In the final chapter, we get to see that Alex is still up to his old ways, but one of his droogs that we didn't see after the time skip, Pete, appears and is reunited with Alex. Pete has grown up and out of his childish ways. He now has a family, and Alex has a revelation that maybe he can't continue with his childish ways for the rest of his life. This last chapter actually does show that Alex was cured, though it's not in the same fashion as we've seen earlier. Alex grows up and he makes a genuine choice to change. We can assume that Alex no longer has to put up the charade and switch back and forth between Alex the performer and Alex the person. His inner self has not been trampled upon, and it's still accessible to him. His genuine inner self and his whole grounding as a person develops, and we can imagine that this is for the better. Alex is no longer a divided self. He becomes whole, able to unite his outer and inner self towards a person who willingly gives up ultraviolence. There is no Alex a performer. All that remains is Alex as a genuine person. Thanks for watching. I hope this video helped you see A Clockwork Orange in a new light. I'd love to hear what you thought about the analysis, so leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like button. If you like these videos where I talk about psychology and films, be sure to click the box up here to check out my Spirited Away film analysis and psychoanalysis.